She was one eviction notice away from the street. He was the most dangerous man in the room, and in one catastrophic second, a tilting tray, a ruined suit, and a business card pressed into her shaking hand, their worlds collided in a way neither of them could undo. He didn't fire her. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply said, "Call me tomorrow, noon, don't be late." What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was a contract, a lie built to protect a dying man's last wish. 5 days, $300,000, and rules she could never break. Or she'd never be safe again. What she didn't know, the most dangerous part of this deal, wasn't his family. It was her own heart. Welcome to a channel where power meets vulnerability. Stories of mafia bosses who guard empires but can't guard their hearts, love that survives betrayal, and families that break and rebuild in the most unexpected ways. If that moves you, you're exactly where you belong. The lesson this story carries: no matter how broken your beginning is, the right choice, made at the right moment, even a desperate one, can become the foundation of everything beautiful. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me, would you have signed that contract? Share this with someone who loves a story where love wins against all odds. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next.
The night had been a struggle from the moment she walked into Luminaire. Her black uniform, once a perfect fit, hung loosely on a frame thinned by stress. She saw it in her reflection, the exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes. Every glittering chandelier and clinking champagne flute only highlighted how far her own life was from this world of effortless luxury she served. But the real story started hours earlier, on a city bus, with an eviction notice folded in her pocket. It was the latest in a stack of bills that had piled up since her father's death 8 months ago. The cancer had taken him, and the medical debt he left behind took everything else. His life insurance had lapsed. He'd chosen her college textbooks over the premiums, but she'd had to drop out anyway. At 23, Arya Bennett felt ancient. Every shift was a battle against a tide of debt threatening to pull her under. She served men who spent more on a single drink than she had for a month's rent, smiling until her face ached. And so, when that dessert tray fell, it wasn't just about a ruined suit. It was about the absolute end of the line for a girl who had nothing left to lose. The elevator doors slid open, revealing not a hallway, but a vast, sun-drenched penthouse overlooking Central Park. This was the destination. Her journey here had been a silent, 40-floor ascent with an operator who smiled kindly, ignoring her shaking hands. An hour before that, a sleek black town car had arrived precisely at 1 p.m. to collect her from a world of broken elevators and peeling paint, its driver opening her door as if she were someone important. This was the result of a single phone call. That call was a last-minute decision made at 11:59 on Christmas morning. He answered on the first ring, saying her name like a fact. Arya Bennett. He simply stated a car was on its way and hung up, leaving no room for questions. She had spent a sleepless night staring at the heavy, plain business card, weighing the impossible choice it represented. The eviction notice on her door was a constant reminder that her current path led nowhere. Survival was no longer working. She had nothing left to lose. She was only in this position because her manager, Gerald, had insisted she take the $2,000. The money felt wrong, a complication she couldn't afford. But Morelli had left it for her, payment for the ruined suit, for the interrupted dinner, and for her silence. Gerald explained who she'd offended. Dante Morelli, a man whose family practically owned the city. Instead of being fired, she was on probation, holding a check that felt more like a summons than a windfall. It was a strange reward for what had happened. She'd stood mortified in the center of the dining room, the scent of spilled creme brulee thick in the air. The man's companions were frozen, their laughter gone. His dark eyes were fixed on her, his expression impossible to read. Every instinct told her to run, but she was paralyzed by the certainty her life was over. He moved toward her and she braced for the inevitable firing. Instead of anger, he simply reached into his ruined jacket. He didn't yell or cause a scene. He just pulled out a small, heavy business card with nothing but a name and a number. Dante Morelli. He pressed it into her trembling hand, his fingers steady and warm. "Call me tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Noon. Don't be late." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her in the middle of a disaster she had created. And that's how it all began. With the clatter of a falling tray, a ruined dessert, and the collapse of her entire world splattering across the lap of a complete stranger. It was a simple accident, a clumsy mistake that should have ended with her losing her job. But it didn't. He had looked at her, standing there in her shame and fear, and saw something else entirely. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow on Dante's face as he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. It was a look she hadn't seen until the danger had passed and the lies had become their truth. He squeezed her hand. "It was all worth it," he said, his voice low. That chaotic, terrifying Christmas felt like a lifetime ago. A strange dream that had somehow delivered her here, to this quiet peace. It had been worth every heart-pounding second, especially the moment she'd almost broken the most important rule. His cousin had cornered her in the library, his words like silk-wrapped poison, and she'd remembered Dante's warning, never be alone with any of the men. Her feigned headache and hasty retreat had seemed clumsy then, but Dante later told her it had saved her from a trap that would have ended everything. That was when she first realized the role she was playing was a shield. His shield. That shield had been forged just days earlier, in his sterile penthouse apartment that overlooked the city. He had laid out the terms with the detached precision of a surgeon. "A temporary wife for my family's Christmas gathering," he'd said, as if discussing a merger. "In exchange for your performance, I will pay you $300,000. The number was a shockwave, silencing the questions that screamed in her mind. Enough to erase her father's debts, to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. "Why me?" she'd managed to ask, gesturing to her cheap dress, a stark contrast to his world. "Because you're desperate," he'd stated, not cruelly, but as a simple fact. "And because you have integrity. You tried to fix your mistake last night instead of running." He saw her as honorable, yet he was hiring her to deceive his entire family. The paradox was dizzying. "I need someone who will honor our agreement," he had explained, "even when it gets difficult. And believe me, it will." His family was complicated, a word that felt like a massive understatement. He didn't explain why he needed a wife so suddenly, only that his reasons were his own. The offer was simple: 5 days of acting, and she could walk away from the struggle that had defined her entire life. But there were conditions, absolute and non-negotiable. She was to tell no one. She had to be utterly convincing. And the third rule, the one he delivered with a chilling seriousness, was the most critical. "You must never be alone with any man in my family." His tone left no room for debate. "It's for your protection," he insisted when she questioned the bizarre rule. "Some of my relatives don't respect boundaries. Break that rule, and I can't guarantee your safety." The casual way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He made it clear this wasn't a vacation. His family would test her, looking for any crack in their story. She would have to become his wife in less than a day, memorizing a lifetime of fabricated memories. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, and it was insane. But as she looked at the mountain of debt suffocating her, insanity felt like a reasonable price for freedom. "I want a contract," she heard herself say, the words grounding her in the sheer madness of the moment. He smiled then, a flash of warmth in his cold demeanor. "I already had one drawn up." The document was straightforward, outlining the 5 days of service, the $300,000 payment, and the severe penalties for breaking their confidentiality. A clause about required public affection, hand-holding, brief kisses, made her hands tremble. I won't touch you without permission, he'd assured her quietly. She stared at the paper, her future balanced on the tip of a pen. $300,000. A clean slate. Do you have a pen? She asked. And with a steadying breath, she signed her name, her small signature dwarfed by the official contract. Welcome to the family, he'd said, his expression unreadable. But even then, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. All of it, the contract, the danger, the hope, had begun the night before. She was rushing through the exclusive restaurant on a double shift, exhausted and overwhelmed, when she stumbled. A tray of expensive red wine met the pristine white shirt of a man whose suit probably cost more than her car. The crash, the gasp from nearby tables, the stains spreading across his chest. That single clumsy accident was the beginning of everything. It was the moment that set her on a collision course with Dante Morelli. Though at the time, all she could see was the end of her job and the start of a debt she could never hope to repay. The massive doors of the Morelli family compound swung open. Dante squeezed her hand. Remember, you're my wife. Act like it. His voice was low but firm, a final instruction before facing the storm. Arya's heart hammered against her ribs. The estate was a sprawling stone giant on acres of snow-covered land, both a dream and a nightmare. Welcome to the place where Christmas comes to die, Dante had said with a dry smile moments before. Now, facing the family inside, she wasn't sure if he was joking. Ready? He'd asked. She had no choice. She belonged here because he said so. Just an hour earlier, the town car had crunched up the long, tree-lined driveway. The 3-hour drive from the city had been a final cram session. Where did I propose? Dante had quizzed, his eyes fixed on his laptop. Brooklyn Bridge, sunset, she'd recited. Favorite restaurant? Piccolo Angelo, third date. He'd finally looked at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes. He warned her his family would be skeptical. He'd never brought anyone home before, let alone a wife they'd never met. Stick to the story, he'd said, taking her hand. I won't let you fail. Their story was a carefully constructed fiction, built over 3 hours in his study. The meeting at a charity gala 6 months ago, the quiet courtship to shield their romance from his intrusive family, the whirlwind civil ceremony 3 weeks prior. Won't they find the rush suspicious? Arya had asked. They'll find it romantic, Dante had assured her. It runs in the family. But why me? She'd wondered aloud. You're out of my league. His answer was simple and unbelievable. You fell in love. You saw past the name to the person underneath. The heavy metal credit card sat on her desk, a silent reminder of a closed chapter. 6 months after the funeral, Arya would sometimes trace the embossed name, Dante Morelli, and recall the quiet nod he gave her as they parted ways. The pact was fulfilled. His grandfather had found peace in his final days, believing his grandson was truly happy. That was the real service she had provided, far more valuable than the $300,000 now sitting in her bank account. It was a lie, yes, but a lie crafted from love. That lie had been cemented during the family's Christmas gathering. To everyone else, it looked like a perfect marriage, especially after the incident by the fireplace. She remembered the chilling grip of Marco's hand on her arm, his cruel smile too close. Then Dante's voice, low and dangerous, cut through the air. Take your hand off my wife. The protective fury in his eyes had been utterly convincing. It was in that moment, under the watchful gaze of the entire Morelli clan, that their performance became real. He had promised to keep her safe, and he had. They had rehearsed for that reality for hours. In his penthouse, he taught her how to stand close without flinching, how to hold his hand as if it belonged there. Look at me like you love me, he'd instructed. When she struggled, he'd gently prompted her. Think of your father, that uncomplicated pride. And when she did, his breath had hitched. He was patient, always asking before a touch, making sure the lines were never blurred. He wasn't just teaching her to act, he was preparing her for survival among his family. He had shown her the battlefield beforehand, scrolling through photos on his phone. There was the patriarch, Lorenzo, with eyes as sharp as a knife. Then came Marco, the smiling predator. He's the reason for the rules, Dante's voice had hardened. He doesn't understand boundaries. He explained that Marco's past indiscretions with women had been quietly erased by family money. The promise, "I will keep you safe from him," wasn't part of the act. It was the foundation of their entire agreement. To face them, she needed the right armor. She remembered staring at the unlimited credit card he offered. "Consider it a business expense," he'd said, dismissing her hesitation. "You can't play the part if you don't look it." It wasn't charity, it was a costume. He needed her to look like someone who could plausibly be his wife, to be convincing not just to his family, but to herself. Slowly, she had taken the card, the first piece of her new identity. But none of it would have happened without her final question as the elevator doors were closing that first night. "Why are you really doing this?" He held the doors, his composure finally cracking to reveal a simple, painful truth. "My grandfather is dying. Cancer. He has maybe 6 months." His dying wish was to see his grandchildren settled. All the elaborate deception, the money, the rules, it was all to give a dying man one last gift. And standing there, a broke writer about to embark on the biggest lie of her life, Arya finally understood. It wasn't about greed, it was about grace. The person underneath had surprised her over dinner. He'd asked about her father, and the question unlocked a flood of memories. His terrible jokes, his unwavering belief in her. Her throat had tightened as she explained why she'd taken this deal. "He deserved better than dying in debt, leaving me with nothing." But Dante saw it differently. "He left you with strength," he'd said quietly, setting aside his phone. "That's worth more than money." He then shared his own story, losing his mother at 17, and how his father had faded into a ghost haunting his own study. For a moment, they were just two people who understood loss. But that brief connection came after the cold, hard facts. He'd barely looked up from his plate at first, his questions sharp and precise. "Tell me about yourself," he'd commanded. She told him everything. Growing up in Queens, her father's construction job, the NYU scholarship for literature. "But you didn't finish," he stated. "No." The word was flat, heavy with the story of her junior year, of a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and the mountain of bills that followed. "He got sick. I dropped out to work." The story ended with her father's death, just a few months ago. That was why she was here, answering invasive questions from a stranger. That was why she'd agreed to his offer of $300,000. "A wife!" the old man exclaimed, his voice full of genuine delight. "Finally, my grandson brings me a wife." Lorenzo Morelli pulled Arya into a warm embrace that smelled of expensive cologne and peppermint, the tension in the marble hall instantly dissolving. This was it, the moment their entire gamble hinged upon. He held her at arm's length, his dark eyes inspecting her. "Beautiful," he pronounced with a real smile. "And those eyes? Sharp? Intelligent? Good. My Dante needs a woman who can keep up with him." This warm welcome was the prize, the very reason she was standing in a mansion that felt more like a museum, pretending to be in love with a man she barely knew. Just seconds before, the silence in the room had been deafening. Dante's voice, clear and steady, had cut through the quiet. "I'd like you to meet someone very important to me. This is Arya Bennett, my wife." His Aunt Francesca's smile had frozen, the only sign of her shock a fractional widening of her eyes. "Your wife," she repeated, the word brittle. When Dante explained their private ceremony from 3 weeks ago, her voice turned shrill. 3 weeks? Dante, you've known this girl for what, 6 months? It was then Arya had to step in, gently correcting her. 7 months. We met in May at the Children's Hospital Gala. The family's skepticism, however, was a minor hurdle compared to the danger she'd faced just moments earlier in the library. There, they had met the cousins. One, named Marco, moved with the confidence of a predator. He had taken her hand, not to shake it, but to press it to his lips, his intense gaze never leaving hers. Congratulations, cousin, he'd said, the words a silky threat. Dante's hand had landed hard on his shoulder. Very lucky, Dante replied, his tone light but underlined with steel. The look in Marco's eyes was something she couldn't shake. It was the look of a man who saw a prize he intended to win. That was why Dante's first words to her alone in their suite were a warning. Stay away from him, he said, his expression grim as she sank onto the edge of the king-size bed. He had promised to sleep on the sofa, reinforcing the nature of their arrangement. This is business, Arya. Professional. I will keep you safe, but you have to help me by being careful. He crouched in front of her, taking her hands. Do not let him corner you. His promise of safety was a stark reminder of the risks she was taking, far beyond just fooling an old man. They were in this together, but she was the one in the line of fire. It had all begun with their arrival, a perfectly rehearsed performance from the moment the door opened. Dante's arm had slid around her waist, pulling her close as he introduced her to his aunt. My wife. Their cover story was simple and romantic. A chance meeting where she, a waitress, helped him with a wine stain at a gala. They started talking and simply couldn't stop. A sweet, unbelievable tale of love transcending class. It was a beautiful lie, crafted to win over a patriarch. The truth was far simpler. She wasn't his wife. She was a waitress he had hired to play a part. A desperate solution to a problem she was only just beginning to understand. The old patriarch, Lorenzo Morelli, was finally at peace. He passed away believing his favorite grandson, Dante, had found true happiness. As Arya accepted the final payment, the crisp bills felt heavier than she'd expected. Their contract was fulfilled. She had played her part as the loving wife, and in return, she had the means to finally be free. Lorenzo had died with a smile, convinced he was leaving his family's legacy in capable, loving hands. It was a perfect, beautiful lie. That lie had been born months earlier, not out of love, but desperation. Dante had cornered her after her shift at Luminaire, the frantic energy of a drowning man in his eyes. He'd laid out the insane proposal, pose as his wife for his dying grandfather. He spoke of Lorenzo's final wish, of wanting to see him settled before the end. The money he offered was life-changing, enough to settle debts and start over. All she had to do was convince an old man and his entire suspicious family that she was in love. Before facing the Morelli clan, they had rehearsed their story for hours. Dante prepped her on every family member. Francesca will see you as an opportunist, he warned. Enzo will be blunt, but it's Marco you need to watch. Don't ever be alone with him. They practiced the tale of their whirlwind romance, inventing a sunset proposal on the Brooklyn Bridge. He taught her to see the flicker of a question in his eye as a cue, his hand on her back a silent command. It was a performance, and they were the lead actors. And what a performance it was. During that first family dinner, Arya felt the judgment from all sides. Francesca's smile was a weapon. Going from serving tables to being a Morelli, she'd remarked, that's quite the upgrade. The questions were relentless, each one a test of their fabricated story. Dante's hand finding hers under the table was the only thing that kept her grounded. Lorenzo had cut through the tension, declaring her family, but the unspoken verdict was clear. She was a gold digger. The most difficult moment came when Gabriella asked about the proposal. Arya recounted the lie they had created, the story of Dante dropping to one knee as the city lights came on. As she spoke, Lorenzo's eyes softened. When you know, the old man had said, sharing the story of meeting his own wife, Sophia, when they were just 19. The weight of deceiving such a true romantic was a pang of guilt she hadn't anticipated. It was Marco's intense stare, however, that truly unnerved her, his words about fate and possession feeling like a direct threat. Everything started because Dante had been watching her. For weeks he'd sat at a corner table during her shifts, observing. He didn't see a waitress, he saw a solution. He noticed how she handled difficult customers with unwavering calm, how a quiet strength radiated from her even when she looked exhausted. She wasn't looking for a handout or a way up. She was a survivor, and that, he decided, made her the perfect person to sell the biggest lie of his life. With a slow nod, Lorenzo's sharp eyes softened. "Good enough," he said. "Love grows if you nurture it." He looked from Arya to his grandson, his voice gaining strength. "My Sophia didn't love me at first, but I won her over." He then turned to Dante. "Don't mess this up, boy. Good women are rare." Dante's quiet promise, "I won't," hung in the air. As they left the study, Dante murmured, "He liked you. That's half the battle won." Arya knew he was right. They had pulled it off. The dying patriarch believed in their love, and for now, that was everything. But that victory had been hard-won just an hour before. Seated in the conservatory, Arya had faced a tribunal led by a skeptical Francesca. "So, a charity gala?" Francesca began, her smile like a razor's edge. Arya calmly recounted the story they'd rehearsed, the spilled wine, the shared love for obscure French novels. When Gabriella asked for specifics, Arya spoke of their debates over Camus, a genuine detail that made Lucia laugh with recognition. But Francesca pressed on, demanding to hear about the proposal again. Arya painted a vivid picture, borrowing from movies and imagination, describing Dante's shaking hands and her own manufactured tears of joy. "He's gotten better," Arya found herself saying, defending him with a surprising earnestness. "He really listens." It was the truth. In the past few days, he had treated her like a partner, not an employee. Staring at her, Aunt Teresa said softly, "You really love him." And as Arya answered, she realized with a jolt that she meant it, in a way. "Beautiful," Lorenzo whispered, his eyes shining. "A wise man, your father." And with that, the tension in the room finally broke. She had won. Stepping forward, she'd hung the small glass heart on a prominent branch, her voice steady as she spoke not of grand gestures, but of the simple choice to show up every day. It was the perfect performance. The lie was sealed over espresso in a sun-drenched conservatory. Lorenzo's question about her career plans was the first true test. She glanced at Dante, who gave a subtle nod. She answered carefully, speaking of balance and support. The old man's sincere words about his own marriage, about a true partnership, were a painful reminder of their deception. But his approval was all that mattered. The morning had passed in a blur of polite smiles and introductions to a stream of cousins and friends, her cheeks aching from the effort. Dante had murmured, "Here we go. The real test begins," as the main flood of relatives arrived. The house, once a quiet museum, erupted into chaos. She had survived the warm, probing embrace of Aunt Teresa, a woman in her 60s who smelled of expensive perfume and instantly demanded to know why she hadn't been invited to the sudden wedding. "It was very sudden," Arya had replied smoothly, Dante's hand a constant reassuring weight on her back. They moved through the crowd as one, telling their story until it almost felt real. Yet Marco was always there, a shadow lingering at the edges, his eyes following her. Dante's jaw tightened. He knew she was lying. He led her to a quiet corner, his eyes scanning her face with concern. He saw the tremor in her hands and knew something had happened. He made a silent promise to protect her, a promise that felt more real than their contract. It was the moment their arrangement shifted, the moment Marco's fate was sealed. But this was all because, just minutes before, she'd been trapped. Alone in the hallway, Marco had blocked her path, his presence suffocating. She tried to step around him, but he moved with her, a predator cornering its prey. He dismissed her polite requests to be excused, his voice laced with contempt. "I think this whole thing is fake," he'd sneered, stepping closer until her back hit the wall. "You and Dante, it doesn't add up." "I don't care what you think," she'd said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Now move." He'd laughed, his gaze crawling over her. "You're not his type. He likes sophisticated women, not waitresses playing dress-up." His words were a direct hit on her deepest insecurities. He called her a game player and warned that the family would eat her alive. He left her shaking against the wall, his final words echoing in the silence. "You'll never be one of us." And the only reason she endured it, the reason she didn't scream, was for the sake of the man who had spoken just an hour earlier. Lorenzo, the family patriarch, had stood at the head of the dinner table, his voice frail but firm. "This will be my last Christmas," he announced, silencing the room. He spoke of being at peace, of a life well lived. He asked his family not to pretend, to accept his reality. His dying wish was to see his family settled and happy, his gaze lingering on Dante and Arya. The weight of that wish was a physical burden, making their deception feel both necessary and cruel. It was a lie they had only recently committed to with open eyes. Late the previous night, unable to sleep, Arya had confronted the lie they were telling his dying grandfather. Dante hadn't defended it. He'd crossed the room to sit on her bed, admitting the guilt ate at him every single day. He confessed that the lie was a shield, a way to give his grandfather peace. It was better than the truth. That he was broken, convinced he would die alone, and that the family legacy of love would end with him. "Sometimes," he'd said quietly, "peace is worth the price." The admission had opened a door between them. He told her of his 80-hour work weeks and his empty apartment, of how it was easier to hire a wife than to risk letting someone in. His raw honesty prompted hers. Arya spoke of her own shutdown after her father's death, of working to exhaustion just to avoid feeling how truly alone she was. For the first time, they saw the truth in their arrangement. "Maybe we're not so different," she had whispered in the dark. "Two broken people pretending to be whole." And as he returned to the sofa, he agreed that their shared damage might be the very thing that made their story believable. Which is how Arya found herself waking up alone on Christmas Eve morning, a fresh layer of snow blanketing the world outside. A note from Dante lay on the bedside table, warning her of the traditional Morelli chaos, and ending with 4 simple words: "Stay close to me today." She dressed carefully, slipping the foreign-feeling wedding ring onto her finger, bracing herself for the day ahead. A day that had started with a quiet promise between two strangers. The pressure had been mounting all day. At breakfast, a chaotic affair of shouting relatives and hyper-children, she'd felt Francesca's narrowed gaze from across the table, a silent, constant judgment. Dante had appeared at her side, a practiced kiss on her temple, his presence a shield. He guided her to a seat next to a friendly cousin, but the feeling of being watched never left. It all came to a head during the tree decorating ceremony. One by one, family members hung ornaments representing their story. Marco went up and placed a knight chess piece on a branch. "For those who believe in strategy," he said, his eyes finding hers. A clear threat. The implicit challenge made her skin crawl, but she kept her expression perfectly neutral. Then, Lorenzo called their names. Dante stepped forward with the simple glass heart they had chosen. "For love," he said, meeting his grandfather's eyes. But the old man's gaze shifted to Arya, waiting. And she knew this was the moment that mattered more than any other. This performance had to be flawless. It was exactly what the terrified girl who signed a 3-day-old contract was being paid for. That conviction was fueled by the chilling conversation from the night before. Lying in the dark, with Dante on the sofa across the room, she had asked, "What happens if we fail?" His answer was quiet but firm. "We won't." He explained that if his family discovered the lie, the consequences would be catastrophic. His grandfather's last memory would be one of betrayal. His family's trust would be shattered. "And you'll be caught in the crossfire," he warned. "They're powerful, Arya. Your life could become very difficult." The immense weight of their deception had settled over her then. This wasn't a simple game. It was a high-stakes performance with the potential to ruin lives. "No," she'd said, pulling the covers to her chin, her voice determined. "I needed to understand what's really at stake. We'll make this work. We have to." It was a promise she made to him, and to herself. After all, her life had felt unsafe for a while. That's what she had told Lorenzo when he'd asked her point blank if she loved his grandson. Instead of a simple lie, she gave him a piece of the truth. "I care about him deeply," she'd said. "He makes me feel safe." Because this entire elaborate fiction, The whirlwind romance, the engagement, this holiday visit, wasn't born from love. It was a carefully constructed arrangement, a role she was being paid to play for 5 days to bring peace to a dying man she'd never met. With a crack like a whip, Lorenzo's voice sliced through the tension. Dante, let him go now. For a heartbeat, Dante didn't move, his knuckles white where he held Marco pinned against the wall. A painting rattled from the force. Finally, he released his cousin and stepped back, chest heaving. Lorenzo, struggling to his feet, demanded to know the meaning of the fight. Marco was disrespecting Arya, Dante stated, his voice tight with a rage that still hadn't subsided. But the confrontation hadn't started there. It was the culmination of a threat that had been building all evening. Just moments before, Marco had approached them, unsteady from drinking. He'd demanded a dance with Arya, and when Dante flatly refused, Marco's smile turned ugly. He questioned their marriage, calling Arya a waitress Dante barely knew. That was the spark. Dante stood, his fury a cold, dangerous thing. He warned Marco to stay away from his wife, making it clear that if he made her uncomfortable again, there would be a problem that money couldn't solve. When Marco shot back that Arya was just another acquisition, Dante moved faster than Arya could see. Yet the evening had begun with such a different tone. During the spectacular Christmas Eve dinner, Lorenzo had given a frail but heartfelt speech. He spoke of family, love, and the peace of seeing his empire in capable hands, his eyes landing on Dante and Arya. To family, he toasted, may we always protect our own. The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the silent pressure Arya felt from Marco's unwanted gaze from the far end of the glittering table. She'd clung to Dante's side, the weight of a warning he'd given her earlier, sitting heavy in her stomach. That warning came after a close call that afternoon. She had told Dante everything in a quiet corner. As she spoke, his face grew darker, his hands clenching into fists. I'm going to kill him, he'd said quietly. She had calmed him, insisting she was fine because Gabriella had protected her. But Dante was furious. You shouldn't need protecting from my own family, he seethed, telling her to stay by his side for the rest of the night. He promised to make it clear she was off limits. Gabriella's intervention had been a godsend. Once Marco had stormed off from the library, her ditzy persona vanished. He was trying to get you alone, she stated, her expression fierce. She warned Arya that Marco often cornered women, creating situations where saying no was difficult. Gabriella admitted she didn't know Arya well, but she liked her and urged her to be careful. It was then Arya realized just how real the danger was and how calculated the trap had been. The whole dangerous chain of events began with such a simple, insidious offer. Marco, all smiles and charm, mentioned he had childhood photos of Dante she might like to see. They were in the library, he'd said, on the opposite side of the house, far from everyone else. When Arya hesitated, suggesting he bring the album to them, he pushed. Unless you're afraid to be alone with me, he challenged, his eyes glittering. It was a perfect trap, designed to isolate her and make refusal look suspicious. At the head of the Christmas breakfast table, Lorenzo's voice was firm. Marco has been sent home. He stated plainly that his grandson's actions toward Arya were inexcusable. Turning to her, he offered a sincere apology on behalf of the family. You are one of us now, he said, his tired eyes full of conviction. And we protect our own. Then, looking at Dante, he nodded with pride. You did what a man is supposed to do. You protected what matters. Under the table, Dante's hand found Arya's, a gesture that now felt completely natural. It was the moment the lie became real for everyone else. What no one at that table knew was that just an hour before, Arya had woken up on the sofa with her head on Dante's shoulder. They had fallen asleep talking, tangled together in a way that felt both terrifying and right. For a long second, they just stared at each other in the pale morning light, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings. The comfortable quiet was broken by a knock at the door, summoning them downstairs to face the family and the consequences of the previous night. Their night had ended there on the sofa after the party guests had all gone to bed. Dante, with his head in his hands, admitted he'd lost the one thing he never loses: control. He confessed his anger wasn't just about protecting her, it was about a deep, confusing possessiveness over someone he'd technically only hired. But Arya saw past the contract. She took his hand, her touch grounding him. "This feels real to me," she'd whispered, and in the silence of the old house, he hadn't disagreed. That raw confession was the result of the evening's public explosion. Dante had finally snapped, cornering his cousin Marco in the middle of the party. "You've been stalking her." Dante's voice was low and dangerous. When Marco tried to play it off, Gabriella spoke up, confirming he'd tried to lure Arya away earlier. The cousins who had been friendly with Marco took a subtle step back. Lorenzo's expression had turned to stone. "Marco, my study, now." The look of pure hatred Marco shot Dante promised this was far from over. As his grandfather led Marco from the room, Dante had turned to Arya, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" he'd asked, his voice shaking with leftover adrenaline. She'd thanked him, overwhelmed by the fierce way he'd defended her. This was more than an act. His anger was genuine. His willingness to start a family war to keep her safe went far beyond any business deal. It was the first time she felt like something more than an employee. And she was just an employee, hired to play a role. The fierce protector, the loving husband, it was all supposed to be a performance. Her presence in the Morelli family mansion, the ring on her finger, it all started as a simple, desperate contract. A fake marriage to a stranger to solve her debt and his family problem. As she sat at that breakfast table, accepted and protected, Arya wondered when exactly her own heart had stopped following the script. With his cane steadying him, Lorenzo looked at them both. "I've lived 83 years. You don't get this old without learning to read people." His gaze was sharp, unwavering. "I'm giving you my blessing to make this real. Life is short. Don't waste it." He knew. He'd known all along. Arya's heart hammered as tears streamed down her face. Dante's hand found hers, gripping it tightly. Lorenzo admitted his marriage to Sophia also began as a practical matter, but they chose to build it into a deep, unshakable love. "That's what I want for you," he said, his voice softening. "The courage to risk your heart." He explained that he wasn't looking for a perfect story, but for the hope that Dante wouldn't end up alone. "You gave me that hope." That hope was built on the performance of the past few days. Lorenzo had watched them, seeing the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. He saw how fiercely Dante defended Arya against the family's scrutiny, and how she navigated their suspicions with grace. To him, it didn't matter if the marriage started as something rushed or unconventional. What he saw was the foundation for something real. Two people who were clearly starting to fall for each other, even if they hadn't admitted it to themselves. He'd been suspicious at first, of course. Dante had never even brought a woman to a family event, and now he was suddenly married. It seemed all too convenient. But convenience was exactly how it started. "One more day," Dante had said just moments before his grandfather's visit. "Tomorrow, we drive back, and this is over." He had promised to transfer the money to her account, freeing her from debt. Their bargain was simple. She would play the part of his loving wife to grant his dying grandfather peace. Dante believed he was giving the old man a comforting lie. He never imagined his grandfather would see through the act to the truth underneath, a truth neither of them had been ready to face. "Okay," she whispered, the single word filled with a dangerous hope. "Let's make this real." His answering smile softened his sharp edges, and when she kissed him, it felt less like a choice and more like coming home. "We should tell them it's real now," he murmured. "My grandfather will be insufferable. He'll say he knew all along." And he had. Just nights before, Lorenzo had summoned them to his study. The old man looked frail, but his eyes were sharp. He handed them an envelope. "My blessing," he'd said, in writing. "A shield for when I'm gone." He knew his other grandson Marco would cause trouble, would claim their marriage was a sham for the inheritance. "This letter protects you," Lorenzo insisted, his hands trembling. It proves I saw your love. It proves I believed in what you could become. Turning to Arya, he made a final request. Take care of him. He's not as tough as he pretends. 3 days later, at dawn, the call came. Lorenzo was gone. The funeral was a massive affair, a testament to the empire he'd built. Arya stood by Dante, her hand a steady anchor in his, a silent partner through his grief. As he spoke of his grandfather's wisdom and final blessing, his voice cracked. In that shared sorrow, their pretense solidified into an unbreakable bond. The family, watching them, saw it too. But their unity had been forged in a crucible of deception just days earlier, when Lorenzo first arrived. His grandfather hadn't given them his blessing then. Instead, he had given them his permission, seeing straight through their act. He'd left them in stunned silence, their lie exposed not with anger, but with a gentle push toward truth. It was in that moment, after Lorenzo left the room, that the charade truly ended. I need to tell you something, Dante had said, his voice raw. The money I promised you, it's yours no matter what, for playing this role perfectly, for handling my family. You earned it, but I don't want you to take it and leave. You made him happy in the end, Francesca said, her voice low amid the mourners. Arya nodded, her hand held tight in Francesca's. It wasn't hard to love him. In the quiet weeks that followed, they found their rhythm. Dante would come home, weary from managing the estate, and she would be there. They were learning each other in the silent spaces, his need for quiet mornings, her music while cooking, the unconscious way they found each other in the dark. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was becoming real. Just 3 months after Lorenzo's death, that future had been cemented. Marco challenged the will, calling the marriage a fraud, but Lorenzo had been one step ahead. A handwritten letter dismantled the claim, and a separate trust revealed his true gift. Not money, but properties for their life together. He gave us 3 buildings, Dante had said, his voice thick with emotion, staring at the deed, including the one where we met. The old restaurant. Lorenzo had bought it 6 months ago, knowing. Standing in the dusty, empty space, they decided to build something new, something that would honor him. Their real beginning had come months earlier, long before they renewed their vows in a sun-drenched garden. Lying in bed, no longer separated by an unspoken distance, she traced patterns on his chest. Do you ever regret it? Dante asked, his voice barely a whisper. Saying yes to my crazy plan? Arya smiled. Every day I'm terrified I'll wake up. But regret? Never. His confession mirrored hers, a fear of messing it up. Then we'll be terrified together, she'd said, meeting his gaze. Your grandfather was right. It's about what we choose now. It was then, with a simple kiss, that they chose each other. With the officiant's blessing, Dante kissed Arya, a promise that felt both ancient and brand new as their friends and family erupted in cheers. It was a perfect fairy tale moment. Later that night, Arya stood alone in the garden, her gaze falling upon the memorial bench for Lorenzo, his grandfather. The plaque read, Love is the foundation, build well. This perfect day, this incredible happiness, was proof that they had. But this seemingly effortless joy was built on a foundation laid months before, a moment that had cemented their future. It happened that Christmas, when they gathered the family to announce the opening of a community center named for Dante's grandmother. Amid the applause, Arya quieted the room. There's something else, she said, taking Dante's hand and placing it on her belly. The brief silence shattered into shrieks of joy as the family swarmed them with hugs and happy tears. Holding her close, Dante didn't hide his own emotions. This shared future was a universe away from the girl she had been just 1 year prior, a girl willing to lie and make a deal with a stranger just to survive. That night, Dante murmured, You know, if you hadn't dropped that tray, we'd still be strangers. She laughed. Thank God I'm clumsy. It was a joke that held the entire truth of their story. That truth was rooted in a desperate proposal, one that had started not with love, but with a contract. an agreement that was now long gone, replaced by trust and vows from the heart. Their love had grown in the most unlikely way, a gamble that paid off beyond her wildest dreams. He wasn't the man who trapped her. He was the one who set her free by showing her that sometimes the most desperate choice can become the start of everything that matters. It all began not in a ballroom, but in a restaurant, with a ruined suit covered in creme brulee and a business card pressed into her trembling hand. "Call me tomorrow," he'd said, changing her entire world. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.